if you find ways as a leader or as a team to make sure that everybody's voice is being heard in the room, and not just heard, but also responded to effectively, I think that goes a long way. Very basic things like appreciating contributions. Just to have a leader or a manager or a colleague say to you, hey, I really appreciated the way you showed up in that meeting. I really appreciate the way that you delivered on that particular project. That goes such a long way to help create safer spaces for people to work in. Coaching each other, coaching team members to support each other, and to not have it be a zero-sum game approach where if someone else is going to be successful, that means I'm going to be a failure. Welcome, folks, to the Changing Work podcast. I'm Nick Whitaker, co-founder of the Changing Work Collective.
Hey, I'm Scott Shute. I'm the other co-founder. So we are happy to be here. And today, what are we talking about today, Nick?
We're talking about psychological safety, Scott. It's a topic I feel like comes up quite a bit in our conversations, both with each other and then just generally speaking as we're thinking about how to change work from the inside out. And I figured it'd probably be a good topic to start off with in the early days of the podcast.
It's a good start. And I know that's a big word, right? Psychological safety. First of all, why are we talking about this? Why does it matter?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, I think psychological safety is really the underpinning of what makes so much of other things within the workspace actually work correctly. If you don't have trust, if you don't have mutual respect for each other, if you don't have those really fundamental principles of like compassion and engagement with each other, you're not going to be performative. You're not going to be able to be innovative. You're not going to be able to be creative. And I think that's a lot of what I've seen myself in my experiences within workplaces is a lot of attention paid on output and on productivity, but not on the things that actually need to be nurtured in order for that to even occur in the first place.
Yeah, it's a big deal. In fact, Google, you were at Google for a long time. Google did this project called Project Aristotle, and I'd be fascinated to know why they started it. But they did this big study to figure out what were the biggest elements that created high-performing teams. And this is why I'm fascinated. I wondered what they were looking for, But what they found was it wasn't your IQ or where you went to school or level of diversity or level of whatever. It was psychological safety. Psychological safety is the single biggest factor in creating a high-performing team.
Yeah.
So in your own experience, what would you say, was there a time when you had it, when you had psychological safety? And then were there times when you didn't? And what was the impact to you personally?
Yeah, it's a powerful set of questions right there. I think you're right. I had a very, very long career at Google. I was there for 13 years. And I bridged my time there during the time of that Project Aristotle and then a couple other projects called Project Oxygen and a few other studies were actually done around these exact topics. Ironically, the last team that I worked on was one of the teams that actually created the Project Aristotle study in the first place. And a lot of times what I would notice or what I would experience, and this was actually in the earlier days when I was at Google, back in the 2010, 2011, 2012 era, there was a lot of attention paid to well-being, to culture, to the ways that people engaged and interacted with each other. It was also a lot smaller of a company. I think when I was at that company back then, it was something like 35,000 or 40,000 people. When I left just this past year, back in 2023, I think it was something close to 170,000 people at the company. So obviously a different beast that we're talking about there. But I think, a lot of the teams that I was on in the early days, they were kind of like startups, so there was this real norming, storming, forming kind of process that was going on. There was a lot of attention paid to how people engage and interacted with each other. And the fact that the teams and the organizations were just smaller overall, I think it was just easier to manage, broadly speaking. I can't speak to why they created Project Aristotle in the first place, but I know it was a huge splash moment when they put that out there, and it has become kind of this gold standard for research in terms of what could make for effective teams and make for psychologically safe teams. And people still reference it to this day. I think the interesting thing that happened was as Google grew and as a lot of these companies grew over time, a lot of that early research and a lot of that early work maybe got put on the shelf. And it was yes, this is nice to do when we have time to do it, but we're actually trying to scale exponentially here. And that's kind of what I felt was really happening more and more over the years, was there was less of an attention on those cultural elements and those fundamental bonding elements within teams and more interest in like output or launches or scale. And I think that was maybe some of the downfall, at least in my own personal experience within the specific teams that I was in, that maybe created lack of psychological safety and kind of maybe got a little further away from where Project Aristotle was trying to get people to.
Sure. Let's make it easy, right? Because I don't know if everybody even knows what we're talking about when we talk about psychological safety. So if we break it down into what it is, so I show up on a team, I guess what it means to me is I feel safe around you guys, right? I feel safe to be me. I feel safe to be, I'm not going to get stabbed in the back. There's some level of trust between us, and when we have that trust, then I can feel comfortable. Is that what it means to you, or is it something different?
Yeah, I think it's pretty close. I mean, honestly, so I'll answer this question with like a bit of a story. So I've had really, really positive experiences with teams and with leaders, and I've had really, really poor experiences. And I think the big differentiator between the two was I able to show up fully as myself? Was I able to take risks? Was I able to speak up when I saw something that needed to be changed or when I felt uncomfortable about something? Was I able to disagree openly with colleagues or with leaders? Was I able to surface concerns that might be negative in a way that wouldn't necessarily create negative repercussions on myself? And if I look back at my career and I looked at what made for good teams and what made for poor teams, it really came down to those particular elements. Like, was I able to feel comfortable speaking out and sharing what I was experiencing without fear of repercussion?
That's it. It's all about fear, right? So if we what we're talking about is, here's why this is important for teams. If everybody is afraid and they're just keeping their head down and then they're in survival mode, you're not going to push the envelope. You're not going to get creative solutions. You're not going to get, open feedback. When a leader asks, hey, how am I doing? Everybody's going to go, great, you're doing great. They're not going to be open and give you any critique about what could be better or how our product or service could be better. So it becomes very vanilla. But when people, as you described, feel like, oh, I could be myself, I can take risks, I can be creative, I can try to come up with different solutions, man, we're going to get so much better solutions for our customers and for each other. It's counterintuitive to the needs of the business. So you were saying, well, in your shop and lots of other places, some of this work got put on the shelf because, we just need to make money. Like, it's hilarious. Like when we need to make money, we forget all these things. But this is exactly how you build a successful business, is to create environments that are like this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, that idea of profit over people or scale at all costs, or in the case of Google, like their big moniker was move fast and break things. I think like what is underneath that is a lack of care, a lack of consciousness, a lack of compassion and empathy for other people's experiences. And I think what happens is it creates this environment where it becomes a zero-sum game. People get into these organizations, they are more focused on status, on promotion, on the money aspects, and they kind of maybe lose the underpinning of why they were there in the first place, what really excited them about being part of an innovative company or being part of like a company on the cutting edge of technology. And I think that's where things start to unravel very fast. And that starts at the top. I mean, I think that starts at the executive or the C-suite level, and it trickles its way all the way down. To me, it has so much to do with what's being incentivized. So if you look, for example, at performance reviews within a lot of these different companies, performance reviews often were done once or twice a year. It was very much set up in a way that it was very subjective based on the manager's view of what was happening. It was very easy to game in the early days, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to get 5 or 6 peer reviews of people that I know are going to give me really shining, awesome reviews, probably my friends, and position that in front of my manager in hopes that might sway their opinion of what I've been up to for the last few weeks or months or years. And I think there's something about that, aiming for the performance review, aiming for the launch, that creates this environment where people are less concerned about collaboration and they're more concerned about what it looks like for them in terms of like what their contribution was to a project or how successful they were at launching a thing. And I think if you kind of reconceptualize the way performance reviews were approached, maybe even got rid of them altogether, I think what you would notice would be people collaborating more, working together more, trying to solve problems in a collaborative way. And I think that would, by nature, create a greater sense of psychological safety because it's a team orientation as opposed to an individual orientation.
Yeah, a lot of what you talk about is the moving from fear to safety. Mm-hmm. And if we break it all the way down, like, why do we do this as humans? We can talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which kind of describes this. I've been watching this show. I haven't finished it yet, but I started. It's amazing. I think it's called Chimp Empire. It's one of these nature shows, and I'm a sucker for those. Back from the old Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom when I was a kid. I love these things. Anyway, in Chimp Empire, they follow this troop of, I think it's called a troop of chimps living in Uganda. And in this world, it's pretty amazing. I mean, these chimps are very us-like. They're very human-like. Their eyes, their hands, like this is the closest to us, the Homo sapien, as we can get. And they live in a resource scarce environment, so they will defend their territory. And this is how they have evolved. It's how we have evolved to stay alive. So in their territory, if another chimp from another group comes into their territory, they will kill it, like no questions asked. And they're constantly defending their border. And why that's important is because that border contains these big fig trees that have all the food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of this programming that we have as Homo sapiens comes from this idea that we evolved in a resource scarce environment, and that to stay alive, we have to operate in a certain way. Well, but we don't typically live in a resource scarce environment now. We have plenty of resources as a company level, but this is what happens. In fact, when the company's doing very well, when a Google or LinkedIn or whoever is flush with cash, it's easy to talk about culture. It's easy to talk about the best things in life, the very top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, And when things get tough, when you start feeling like it's resource scarce, then all of that other stuff seems to get put on the shelf. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question is, what do we do about it? Like, if you're a leader in one of these companies, like I'm remembering back to 2016 myself, I was at LinkedIn. I was a senior leader there. We'd had some headwinds, in 2016, and all of a sudden we're all doing budget cuts. And you start to be afraid because you get afraid for your own group, your own tribe. You get afraid for whatever. But knowing all these things, I don't know, what do you think we can do differently?
Well, I think there's a lot there. I mean, first of all, I love the fact that you're watching that show. I think there's a lot that we can learn from primates. Generally speaking, there's a saying. I don't know exactly who originally said it. It might have been Jack Kornfield, but he said the nervous monkeys are the ones that survived. Yeah. If you kind of think about it, like, we're evolutionarily designed to be anxious. That's what kept us alive out in the wild, and those are still parts of us that we bring into the workplace. And there's so much of it that, in my experience, goes back to the core concepts of, like, are we in an environment that we feel safe in? Are we in an environment that feels abundant? Mm-hmm. And that shows up in a variety of different ways. People talk about it in terms of imposter syndrome. I think imposter syndrome is actually a fallacy. It's a condition that's occurring because of an environment that somebody is in. It's not a syndrome that an individual actually is exhibiting. It's an environmental concern. Same thing with burnout. I think a lot of times people who experience burnout, it's connected to the same things that spur imposter syndrome. It's a lack of boundaries. It's a lack of understanding of what roles and responsibilities are. It's a lack of appreciation for people's contributions. It's a lack of feeling like they have their voice to be heard and can we express it effectively. It comes down to, like, understanding, like, what the role of failure is within organizations. And if you can find ways to, say, reframe mistakes as learning opportunities, as not a punitive thing that's going to show up on your performance review at the end of the year, but something that's actually encouraged. If you find ways as a leader or as a team to make sure that everybody's voice is being heard in the room, and not just heard, but also responded to effectively, I think that goes a long way. Very basic things like appreciating contributions. Just to have a leader or a manager or a colleague say to you, hey, I I really appreciated the way you showed up in that meeting. I really appreciate the way that you delivered on that particular project. That goes such a long way to help create safer spaces for people to work in. And a lot of this, I think, comes down to coaching, honestly. I mean, I'm a little bit biased as a coach myself, but, coaching each other, coaching team members to support each other and to not have it be a zero-sum game approach where if someone else is going to be successful, that means I'm going to be a failure. I think these are the big concepts. And obviously there's tactical things that you can get into and drill down to each one of those things. But I think at a high level, it's like, are we thinking about this holistically? Are we approaching this not as here's a project that needs to launch and a mission that we need to do, but there's a community of people that are all moving towards something together? I think that's maybe a different approach that could be put into practice.
Totally. And I think we're much more likely, if I think about it as leaders, we're much more likely to be able to operate like that in the good times. Mm-hmm. When things are good, we as leaders are more comfortable and we are able to think about, okay, I need to give gratitude out, or I need to thank my team, or I need to think about the culture. And when things are bad, we go to fear-based and we think, oh, I just have to get this project out because blah, blah, blah. So maybe it starts with, of course, leaders, but every single one of us to recognize when we're acting as that, sympathetic nervous system animal just trying to stay alive, and just to recognize it, to say, I'm actually not in danger, probably. Most of us, right? I'm actually not in danger. So that's a starting place. And then it goes from there. Here's a question though. So let's say you're a leader, you're leading a team, and you are in an environment where probably layoffs are a real thing. There's been rumblings above you. You know something's coming. It's not for sure yet. Nobody knows exactly what. So you have a lack of information. Can we still create psychological safety even in an environment where we are going to do layoffs, or we might do layoffs?
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think those are mutually exclusive things at all. Like layoffs, budget cuts, reorgs, these are all part and parcel to the corporate space or the workplace. I think maybe a distinction between, say, trust and psychological safety could be really useful here. If you think about trust is like an interpersonal, one-to-one or individual kind of personal connection. Like I trust you, you trust me. That allows us to be able to work together effectively. The way I look at psychological safety, it's actually more of a group level attribute. It's something where everybody within that organization can feel like they can express their thoughts without fear or criticism. Then you have psychological safety. And there's research behind this. Like McKinsey, I think, was one of the consultancy firms that actually put out a whole report around psychological safety and what are like the key factors around that. And surprise, surprise, like what they discovered with this is that having a positive team culture and environment is what helps psychological safety occur. So having a positive and kind of open team culture, that's something that isn't just a one and done thing. That's an ongoing process that requires everybody's involvement. Let's say you're in the middle of an economic downturn and there's layoffs coming. What's one way to create a positive and open team environment during that period of time? To me, it would be transparency, like having honest conversations. Even just what you just said a minute ago is like, hey, where there's rumblings going on of potential layoffs, we don't have all the information yet, but we wanted you to let you know that this is something to consider. We'll let you know as things develop over time, and we'll keep you informed. I think that would go an enormous way towards allowing people to still feel psychologically safe. And then also, I think on top of that, creating open opportunities for people to have dialogue around those things. Just being able to express fear over layoffs, even if they're not going to be hitting an individual directly, I think would be a powerful component to this. So again, I go back to that idea of like what McKinsey was saying is like this positive culture and team environment, one where people can express their needs and their desires and their worries safely. You can pretty much weather any storm with that.
Yeah, it's not super complicated. It may be hard to do, but it's not complicated. You essentially treat people like you would want to be treated, or treat them like they would want to be treated. Just sometimes challenging in an environment where it's tough. So like most things, it starts with us. It starts with our own self-awareness. It starts with our own practice, our own ability to see what's going on for what it is, not react like an animal. Oh, yeah.
And I think I might add to that too, like, not acting like an animal. I think it's a really important point. And what I hear underneath that is that there are parts of our experience physiologically that are still primate oriented, right?
By the way, there are some animals like dogs, as an example. Great. Sure. Act like a dog. They're the most loving people on the earth.
Totally,
but what I mean is like acting, from that impulse, not from the,
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what I'm tugging on a little bit is like that impulse, that's nervous system response. That's trauma response. That's right. Nervous system activation. And I think one of the things that I always found really effective, both as a community builder and as a leader and as a person that was, holding space for folks in a variety of different capacities, was knowing that in a lot of cases, you have to kind of talk people down from their nervous system activation. If you start a conversation with, hey, I got some bad news to share with you.
Yeah.
Like that's a different experience, that you're going to have than, hey, I know we've been going through a tough time in the last few weeks. There's some things that I need to share with you. We're going to get through this together. It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
But
I've got your back.
I've got your back. And there might be some difficult things I'm going to share right here, but this isn't the end of the world. Like it's a much different way of approaching things than just like hammering somebody with like negative feedback. Right. So I think so much of it has to do with understanding that we're whole people when we come to work. We have a nervous system that's often activated. In a lot of cases, we're in back-to-back meetings, one right after the other, have piles of email to have to deal with. Like there's just a lot of convening factors that create stress in people's experience. So as a leader and as a colleague, if you can identify that and know that like maybe that's where people are coming from and approach it with compassion and empathy first, all of this becomes way easier.
Well said. You had mentioned something, we were chatting, you said there's multiple phases of psychological safety. Do you have that at your fingertips?
Yeah. So there's a few. So there's different schools of thought around this, and there's like different approaches to how people have talked about how to frame up psychological safety. But there's one in particular from this website called Leader Factor that I really like. They call it the 4 stages of psychological safety. And they kind of break it down into 4 different quadrants, and they call it inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. And they basically say that each one of these stages highlights a unique human need that exists across different demographics, geographics, and psychographics. And so if you kind of think about it back from that hierarchy of needs, that Maslow hierarchy of needs, it actually maps pretty neatly with that. And you kind of think about it in terms of, say, like a leader, wanting to create more inclusion safety. That kind of comes back to that idea of like, can you be your authentic self at work, or do you have to mask or otherwise hide the way that you are to fit into some sort of a rubric or into some sort of a box that seems to be the appropriate thing that everyone is doing? So that's one step of it. There's examples of this, so like giving people space to talk, expressing curiosity, verbally acknowledging and actively respecting boundaries. I mean, these things sound pretty simple when you say them out loud, but to our point earlier, when we're busy or when we're under financial pressure, those are often things that go right out the window.
Yeah. Okay. So because I want this to be practical. What was it? There was curiosity. What else was on that list?
Giving people a space to talk, expressing curiosity, verbally acknowledging and actively respecting boundaries would be like the top 3 or 4 within that particular category, which would be called inclusion safety.
So I'm just thinking about my own experience. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in the doing that we lose our curiosity, right? We're focused on the result. We're focused on the time. When is it going to get done? And we lose track of like, hey, how are you? What's going on? And just expressing curiosity or even gratitude for the stuff that's happening is simple. Like this is not rocket science, but it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Incredibly powerful. So just if we did that one thing, if we just stopped, expressed our gratitude, expressed some curiosity, make a connection with the other person, that is very powerful.
Totally. Yeah. And I can give a specific example about that. I mean, every time you and I get on a phone call, there's that moment, where it's like, I think you and I both have this tendency to want to jump right into like the meat of whatever we're talking about. Cause like, hey, TikTok, we got like other things to do. But like, I think both of us do a really good job of checking each other and saying like, hey, wait a second. How was your vacation? Like, how's the family? What have you been up to? I mean, we even just had a conversation last night where you just checked in. You're like, hey, how are things with you and your wife? And it was like, man, when was the last time I had a colleague or a partner ask me something like that ahead of a meeting that was tactical? And it makes such a huge difference in terms of the way that you're able to engage with somebody from there on out. And that's, again, kind of going back to the McKinsey studies, that positive cultural quality. It's something that everyone involved has to be participating in. So if you hop into a meeting and suddenly like the leader or somebody is like jumping in and hitting down the bulleted list of tasks and to-dos, it's like, wait up, hold on a second. Let's go around the room really quick and just check in with people. How are we doing? Like, take that 2 or 3 minutes at the top of a call to set the tone and then move into things from there.
And interestingly enough, something I just learned at MEA, Modern Elder Academy, from one of the folks that has done research and presented there, is that when we engage in pro-social behavior, which is just like it sounds, the opposite of anti-social behavior, when we engage in pro-social behavior, it can add 10 to 15 years to our life, right? And not only make us live longer, but add more life to those years. So this is really important because we often, when we're at work, we're thinking about the task. We're thinking about getting it done. How do I get this project over the line? But if we shift our thinking to, okay, what's the quality of my entire experience here? And a lot of that quality of experience is the people I work with. And if I can shift to, well, that's at least as important as this deliverable, maybe even more important to my overall life satisfaction, then I start to engage with the world in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I hear and what you're sharing there is the difference between short-term goals and long or medium-term goals. If your real goal in the long run is to have a healthy, productive, innovative, and thriving team, sometimes a short-term goal has to be set aside for a little bit or has to be delayed a minute or two in order to be able to see that through. So like we only got 20 minutes for this meeting. We got 20 things we have to go through. All right, maybe we need to like reconceptualize how we're doing meetings and like what is we're actually trying to accomplish within those meetings so that we can still create room enough for that psychological safety to be present.
And look, the work is going to get done. The work is still going to get done. There are enough forces to make sure that happens. Again, we're talking about high performing teams, not just teams that feel good, high performing teams. So to me, it comes down to just remembering like, what kind of team do I want to be on?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's that first pillar, right? The second pillar is learner safety. And this kind of goes back to that idea of like what we're talking about when we talk about failure. In so many of these environments, failure is not seen as something that's a positive. It's seen as a detriment. It's seen as like a knock against someone's skill set, against their ego, against their aptitude. And when you foster learner safety, what you're really doing is creating an environment where people have space to grow. We can't come into an environment and automatically know everything that needs to be known about everything. Like, we're going to have to figure things out. We're going to have to ask questions. We're going to have to fail and fumble in order to be able to like learn and try differently another time. And if you're not creating a team and an environment which allows that to occur, that really quickly becomes a fear-based environment where like, oh my gosh, if I send out this email with the wrong thing, or if I don't format this presentation in the right way, or God forbid this presentation or this project doesn't launch correctly, I'm screwed. If that's the mentality, then you're not going to be able to be innovative first and foremost, because innovation requires some form of failure. There's an iterative process that's required there to be innovative. So, there's ways to foster this as well. Some examples, valuing honesty over correct answers, I think is a really important component. This goes all the way back to the way we're educated and the way we're raised. I know the way I was raised, having a wrong or incorrect answer was not encouraged. If I didn't have the right answer, if I wasn't immediately available to respond in a way, it was looked at as a detriment. Same thing with the way I was taught in school. It was like the kids who raised their hand and had exactly the right answers all the time were rewarded, and the folks that maybe didn't have the right answer were kind of shamed or otherwise thought as being dumb. So what does that do as an adult? It puts you into work environments where you're taught that being incorrect or taking chances is risky and dangerous. Therefore, you're likely not going to do that. You're going to keep your head down. You're going to just do what's safe. And that doesn't make for innovative or highly performing teams. On the other side of that, I think from the leadership perspective, not assuming competency. How many times have you run into a scenario where, you're working with another colleague and suddenly you realize through having a conversation with them, they're like, oh, they have no context about this. They've never actually dealt with this before. You've got this wealth of knowledge that you can provide to them to help get them up to speed. That's a much different approach than just assuming everyone knows exactly what's going on. You just kind of railroad ahead towards a project, assuming that people are like keeping up along the way. And then what happens is those folks that aren't keeping up, they have to scramble and do all this extra work in the background secretly to try to stay competent within the eyes of their leadership or their colleagues for that matter. I think the last piece of this too.
Let me jump in there.
Yeah, please.
So failure can be a beautiful thing. Like you mentioned, there is some, it's necessary to move forward, right? If you think about the light bulb, what was it, like 1,000 times he got it wrong before he got it right? Thomas Edison, and coming up with the exact, filament elements. I was reading this thing the other day where they were talking about how to train AI. They were training AI to be smarter. And it turned out that getting it wrong, there was an element of failure which was critical. And statistically, it was 86% of getting it right. So it's 14% failure rate to make AI learn faster and go faster. So I was thinking, I wonder if this is like this in our own lives, that we have to fail, or if we fail 14% of the time, this is like the optimum amount of failure. Because if you never fail, it means you're really not ever growing, right? You're only doing the things you already know how to do. But if you're failing a lot, then it's probably frustrating and probably slowing you down. So as a leader or as a team, to recognize that failure is part of the deal and that you really express that you have somebody's back as they're failing. I mean, of course, you don't want an environment where somebody's failing 100% of the time, but you want to recognize that as humans, it's part of the deal. And encourage the fast learning that happens with failure versus the hiding that sometimes happens when we fail.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that actually touches on that last category that we were just talking about, in terms of learner safety. Another component of that is identifying what was learned. So, if you have the opportunity to fail and you have the opportunity to have a takeaway from that and understand like, oh, this is what I did incorrectly. This is what didn't work. Here's how I'm going to do that differently in the future. And you have the ability to express that safely to your team and to your leadership. That's a completely different experience than you might have where you have to hide your failures, otherwise keep that under wraps, or when worst case scenarios, and I do see this happen before, you throw somebody else under the bus and blame it on them for the failure, or you blame the system, or you blame the product, or whatever it might be. So I think it's a really, really important point that you're making there.
Awesome. Did we get through the 4 pillars?
Now we got 2 more. So contributor safety would be the other one. And this is a pretty basic one. Can you create value for your team? Like, it's really what it comes down to. It satisfies the basic human need to make a difference and offer meaningful contribution. So again, back to that kind of Maslow hierarchy of needs thing, like, do I have purpose and meaning beyond just like basic, needs being met? And there's ways to go about doing this. So, for example, asking permission before you give feedback, not jumping right into like feedback, whether it's positive or negative. Encouraging equal participation would be another area here. So this is a really simple thing that you might see within team environments where maybe you have some folks that are introverts and some people that are more extroverted. Are you making a point to go around and make sure that people who are quieter are feeling included in that experience?
Yeah, I think, sorry, I seem to be focused on the leaders, but thinking about it from a leader perspective, you're leading a room of people and just realizing the human need, that our desire to contribute is so critical, right? So if we're actively encouraging everyone to contribute, not forcing them, not like, hey, stand up at the board and do this math problem, like in, junior high, but it's creating safe opportunities for them to contribute, knowing that that is part of their motivation strategy. That's pretty powerful.
Absolutely. And I think one last piece of this too that they talk about is like this idea of like bookending expectations at the end or the beginning of your meetings. And this sounds like a really basic thing, but I found this personally to be incredibly helpful for me, where it's like, if you have a very clear understanding of what the expectations are, we do it really well with our individual meetings. What would success look like in this meeting today? Perfect way to start any meeting, right? level setting at the beginning, at the end of that meeting, recapping, okay, here's what we covered. Here's what the action steps are. Here's what each person's roles and responsibilities are moving forward. Do we have any questions here? Is anybody unclear about this? If we could do that with each meeting then actually becomes useful and it becomes something that's tactical instead of what often happens where it's like just a meeting for the sake of having a meeting. Nothing is actually moved forward. No decisions are made.
Yeah. All right. What's the last one?
Challenger safety. So do you feel like you can be candid about change? Challenger safety satisfies, again, another basic human need to make things better. When we create challenger safety, we give air cover or protection in exchange for candor. And unfortunately, this is something I think is one of the hardest things for teams to get their head around a lot of times. Some examples of what challenger safety might really look like is ask for the bad news, right? A lot of leaders that I've worked with in the past and a lot of colleagues that I've worked with in the past, they don't want to hear the ugly stuff. They don't want to hear the bad stuff. They just want to hear like the highlights.
Yeah. I think this is incredibly powerful if a leader says, hey, I want feedback. Like, I'm going to give you feedback. It's part of our performance review, but I want your feedback on me as a leader or me as a whatever. I think that does an incredible job of creating safety, what you're calling challenger safety in the team, because everybody knows the leader's not perfect. We might as well just admit it to start with and say, I want to get better. And it sets the example, it sets the tone for how the rest of the team will operate as well.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. The last bit on this too would be assigning dissent, which I actually particularly enjoy this one. What this really means is like if you're in an echo chamber or if you're in an environment of groupthink, or maybe people are just way too close to the project, right? And we've even encountered this ourselves. Like we're redoing the website, we're all really, really close to it at this point. It's like we can't really be able to discern what needs to be improved and what doesn't. You assign one person within that organization or within that group to be the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
The tricky thing here is that oftentimes this becomes a default mode for like the one person who's the loudest negative or dissenting voice within the community. It's important to rotate that and make sure that that's not just one person that's being that voice of reason or like the devil's advocate. An easy way of doing this, a question that can be asked is like, what are we missing here? Or could this be done differently?
Yeah, I think that role is critical. And as you said, can also be overplayed. So the person doesn't need to take a super zealous, like they don't have to become the devil.
Yeah.
But they can operate in a way that has this curiosity, that has this questioning and done in a wholesome way. So love it.
Yeah. And then the last quality here, and I think honestly, this would probably be the first one, is showing gratitude for the opportunity to learn and improve. And I think this goes both for leaders as well as individual contributors. Having the heroes or having the brave, noble folks within the organization is great. But I think what often happens is that we end up creating a culture where superheroes are rewarded. And that then creates this environment where other people feel like they need to overwork in order to kind of meet that particular hero level output or productivity. So, at all levels, wherever somebody is at, showing gratitude for what they're contributing and the opportunity that they have to learn and grow over that time, I think can be very powerful as well.
Love it. I think that's probably a good space for us to end. So with that, thank you, Nick. I am grateful for your insights into this topic. That's pretty good.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And again, I think folks, if you're interested in topics like this and you want to hear more from the Changing Work Collective and from our podcast, let us know in the comments if you have any thoughts or questions about what you'd like to hear more of from us in the future.
Thanks very much. Go out there and be an ambassador for compassion.